Hi students, welcome back to Economics with Mr. Power. Today we're talking about fiscal policy. This is part of what we're talking about in terms of macroeconomics, how the Fed manages the aggregate economy as a whole. So to understand this, we need to talk about something called the business cycle. The business cycle is a natural phenomenon even before the Federal Reserve that existed, which basically describes upturns and downturns in the economy. At the highest point in economic growth during a given cycle, we call that the peak. The lowest point is called the trough. That's when things are at their worst. When things are getting better, we say that it's experiencing an expansion. The economy is expanding. As that expansion grows, we eventually reach the peak. But what goes up must come down. And eventually we have what's called a recession or a contraction. And this contraction leads to the trough. So how do we measure this? Well, it has to do with the rise and fall of production output. If things are being produced, then we measure the economy as going well, right? When everybody's busy, when unemployment is low and wages are decent, production's high, we generally think of the economy as being healthy. When people are not working, when unemployment is fairly high, and when there's just not enough being exported anymore, then we tend to think of the economy as not doing so hot. So the way we measure this is through something called GDP, or gross domestic product. The gross domestic product is the sum total of every output produced by an economy in a nation. We also have real GDP, which is adjusted for inflation. So fiscal policy is the use of government spending and taxation to manage the economy, to basically help navigate through these recessions and expansions, to control the peaks and the troughs. At least that's the goal. There are three types of fiscal policy. There is contractionary and expansionary, which should sound pretty intuitive so far. There's also discretionary, and we'll talk about that as well. So we can exercise expansionary fiscal policy when we feel like when we feel like the economy needs a boost. When unemployment is high and output is low, then what we may want to do is start spending. And we can do that as a government. At least this is part of the Keynesian theory of managing money. So in the past, we talked about monetary policy. And I want to make sure that you realize that there is a distinct difference between monetary and fiscal policy. So in monetary policy, we're changing how much the money supply exists. Like how much money is there? What are the interest rates? That sort of thing. In fiscal policy, we're controlling government spending and taxation. So again, during an expansionary period, we could spend a lot of money. This could give people jobs. We could create government jobs that gets money in people's pockets. They take that money, they start spending that money, then we feel like the economy is doing better. When we want to contract the economy, when things are inflating, when we think that we're going to cause a bubble to burst, then what we can do is exercise contractionary policy. So you can almost think about expansionary and contractionary policy like a car. You have a brake and you have gas. If you put your foot on the accelerator, you go faster. When you take your foot off the accelerator, it'll slow down. And if you apply the brake, you can eventually come to a stop. You can understand that there are times when you are driving that you would want to go faster or slower. It's pretty natural. Going too fast has its own problems. Going too slow has other problems. So what kind of things might the government spend money on? Well, we've kind of touched on this before. But very simply, if the government needs to give people work, then it can focus on jobs that it needs to get done. One easy way to think about it is infrastructure. Let's say we want to improve some old roads. I'm sure you've experienced a lot of roads in your time where they are full of potholes and cracks and it's bumpy to ride on and it generally just looks trashy. Well, that costs a lot of money to repair or replace that road. So we can hire people to do that, and then they'll work for the government will pay them, and we'll all get a better road out of the deal. So then you might ask, well, why doesn't the government just give everyone a job then? Well, again, money has to come from somewhere. It is entirely produced, like wealth is generated by private industry, by the marketplace. And so without something to tax, then you essentially have nothing. It's all just made up. If you increase taxes, then what you can do is slow down if you're still trying to expand the economy, what you can do is cut taxes. By cutting taxes, you allow people to keep more of their money, and then they can spend it. By raising taxes, what you do is slow down the rate of growth of the economy. People save more and invest less. And that can be what you desire. That is one way to, let's say, apply the brake. Okay, if we want to prevent inflation, a certain amount of inflation from occurring, then we can raise taxes. That's one method. But this also increases government revenue, generally speaking, which means that they'll have more to spend next time they want to expand. So discretionary fiscal policy is essentially trying to reach this balance. It's trying to expand and contract as needed to try to flatten the peaks and curves as much as to flatten the peaks and the troughs as much as we can, to try to get things working in a predictable fashion. However, overdoing it can also stagnate the economy. So you could probably imagine that expansionary policy is generally preferable by voters. It's much easier to be let's say, a presidential candidate. And you get up and say something to the effect of, I'm going to lower taxes and increase government spending. They might not say, I will increase government spending, but they'll say something like, we need a program that does X, Y, and Z. We need to make sure that these people are taken care of. We have a debt in our society to take care of this thing, right? Essentially what they're saying is we're going to spend money. We're going to spend a lot of government money on various programs. Maybe it's even just expanding the military. In any case, it's easy to make that pitch. I want to get you stuff, and I want to make sure that you don't spend as much. That's a very easy sell for a politician. However, discretionary policy would lead us to believe that sometimes we need to exercise contraction. And to do that, we'll have to have some bad news. Sometimes we'll have to say, sorry, I'm going to increase taxes right now. And also, I'm going to spend less. That is a very hard sell for any kind of politician to say, hi, here's my sales pitch. I'm going to give you less and take more. It's not very inspiring. It's not very exciting. So you can see how politics kind of gets in the way of economic realities in a lot of cases. In fact, the government has been guilty many times of staying expansionary for far too long and not slowing down the rate of inflation and causing bigger problems, bubbles burst, and that sort of thing. And it gets much worse in the long run. So you might recall, perhaps, that in 2009, our country endured what was called the Great Recession, kind of like the Great Depression, but not quite as terrible. The government enacted the ARRA, which is the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Essentially, it's expansionary fiscal policy. It bails out various corporations and banks in order to stabilize the economy. So on the one hand, you can prevent an economy from crashing in a much worse way. On the other hand, you encourage protectionism. And what happens in that case is that large institutions become too big to fail. And when that happens, they act irresponsibly because they believe that the government safety net is there. So they take very unnecessary and sometimes abusive risks. So there are a couple of main schools of economic thought when it comes to fiscal policy. In classical economics, it is believed that the government should not be involved in the expansion or deflation of the money supply. That the market should be free, as unregulated as possible, and should solve its own problems. There are some pros and cons to this. On the one hand, the pro is that when everyone realizes that they live in a free market, that means that they can't use the government to protect them. And so they have to make more wise decisions. On top of that, newcomers to various marketplaces don't have a lot of red tape. And so they're able to compete and deal with companies who are larger and eventually overtake them or take the market in a completely different direction. On the other hand, during a crisis, people can panic, and panic can make a recession even worse than it would normally be. Economy is largely based upon thought and faith. And if people believe that things are going poorly, then things will get even worse because people won't spend money, and then that money won't be in circulation. Those people won't spend money. That money that would have been spent on their consumption is not spent by the people that would have gained from it. And you can see how it multiplies out. By knowing that there is a government there to help you, consumers can feel a lot of confidence that their life won't be destroyed. So there's a lot of give and take. But this second theory where government is far more involved, this is developed by a man named John Maynard Keynes. So we use what is called Keynesian theory in the Federal Reserve when we deal with monetary and fiscal policy. So which economic theory is correct? Well, it probably depends. And mostly it depends on what you think. I'm not here to tell you either way. But that is basically a quick breakdown of fiscal policy. When you want to apply the accelerator, you want to cut taxes and spend government money. When you want to contract, you want to increase taxes and decrease government spending. That's pretty much the main gist of it. Discretionary spending is just somewhere in between, making sure that you find that right balance. Okay, that's all for this lesson, and we'll see you next time.